Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? I'm Ed Gallagher. I'm president of the American Scandinavian Foundation, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our headquarters, Scandinavia House in Nordic Center in America, for this afternoon symposium, which is offered in conjunction with our current exhibition, Nordic Utopia. I suspect you've all seen the exhibition. If you haven't, it will be open following the symposium, and it is a wonderful exhibition which we are very, very proud of. As you know, it explores the life and work of African American artists, musicians, writers, dancers, and other creatives who lived and worked in the Nordic countries. And I think it is a terrific exploration of this topic. It's particularly significant for us to be presenting it here at Scandinavia House, which was opened nearly 25 years ago to be a platform and home for the ASF, which itself was founded 114 years ago to maintain understanding and friendship between the Nordic countries and the US. We do this through education and cultural exchange, and this exhibition is a groundbreaking exploration which is so relevant to exploring American history and Nordic history, and of course the history of African Americans. I think it's particularly timely to be offering it these days, and we take great pride in being able to do so. Nordic Utopia was organized and first presented at the National Nordic Museum in Seattle. The curators of the exhibition were Leslie Ann Anderson and Ethelene Whitmire. Both Leslie and Ethelene received fellowships from the ASF. They are with us today, and we are delighted that they will be speaking to us shortly. They will be joined, each giving an individual presentation by Denise Murrell and Tamara Walker. After each of them give an individual presentation, we'll then have a joint conversation moderated by Leslie, and that'll give the opportunity for audience members to ask questions and make comments. We'll then end up with a reception, and of course you can go back up and see the exhibition if you'd like. So we'll move ahead right away. I'd like to introduce all of the speakers, and then we'll let them each speak on their own, and as I say, join in conversation. We'll begin with Ethelene Whitmire, who is a professor in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's a former ASF Fellow, as I mentioned, as well as a Fulbright Fellow. She has published an essay recently that you probably also saw, called Looking for the Restless Soul of Nella Larsen in Copenhagen, which appeared in the New York Times about 2 months ago. She is also working on a book manuscript, The Remarkable Life of Reed Pegram, and is under contract from Viking Books at Penguin Random House to be the author of Regina Anderson Andrews' Harlem Renaissance Librarian. We will then be hearing from Leslie Ann Anderson. Leslie Ann is the chief curator at the National Nordic Museum. She just flew in from Seattle this morning. Since 2019, she has overseen the museum's collections, exhibitions, and program functions. She has developed major exhibitions with a number of institutions in Scandinavia, including the National Museum of Sweden and Finland's Atheneum. She's also commissioned new work from Jonsi, the vocalist for the world-famous band Sigur Rós, and organized the first art exhibition in a U.S. museum of his work. Also an exhibition of his collection, the Fischerthund Art Collective. As co-curator of Nordic Utopia, she has worked closely with Ethelene and co-edited the catalog of the same name. Denise Murrell is with us, and we're very pleased to welcome her. She is the Merrill H. and James S. Tisch Curator at Large in the Office of the Director at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was the curator of the exhibition I'm sure we're all familiar with, and which was such a great show, The Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism, which appeared this past summer at the Met, and she was also editor of the catalog. Previous exhibitions which she worked on include Posing Modernity, the Black Model from Manet and Matisse to Now in 2018 at Columbia University's Wallach Art Gallery, and an expanded version of that, which was entitled The Black Model from Géricault to Matisse, which was presented in 2019 at the Musée d'Orsay. Denise has taught art history at Columbia University in New York and also taught in Paris, and has lectured extensively in the US and Europe. She received her PhD in art history from Columbia University. And our fourth speaker is Tamara Walker, a historian, writer, and nonprofit founder with a wide range of interests. Her first book, Exquisite Slaves, Race, Clothing, and Status in Colonial Lima, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017 and won the 2018 Harriet Tubman Prize from the Schoenberg Center for Research on Black Culture. More recently, she has been focusing on the theme of global black mobility. She is the author of Beyond the Shores, A History of African Americans Abroad, which was published by Crown in 2023. And she has also written related essays in Times Made by History Vertical in Smithsonian Magazine and The Guardian. In addition to working on several new book projects, she is working on the biography of a mysterious black pirate, Tamara. I'll have to hear more about that. And she is the co-founder of Wandering Scholar, a 501c3 nonprofit that makes international travel accessible to high school students from underrepresented backgrounds, doing very important work. So we'll be hearing from all of these people, each with a very, very, I think, fascinating fix on the topic that we're exploring today. And I'd like to first ask Ethelene to take over.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm excited to see all of you out here for this presentation and for this symposium. So as he mentioned, I'm Ethelene Whitmire, and I discovered this story in 2010 when I went to Denmark on a whim for 2 months. I went sight unseen, didn't know a soul there, didn't know they spoke English, thank goodness they did, very well, and I loved it. But I kept hearing stories about African Americans, and I'll tell you, I happened to go back so many times, I think it's 18 times altogether. I've lived there for a year as a Fulbright, and during one summer I lived near a famous cemetery where Hans Christian Andersen's buried, and I stumbled across the grave of a man named Ben Webster. I was like, who is he? Why is he there? It's not Danish. Found out he's African-American musician, a very noted one. There's 2 others buried behind him in the special jazz section. There's probably a dozen African-Americans buried throughout Copenhagen. And there's just a fascinating story that I think has been untold. So I like these untold stories, and I'm going to focus today briefly on one of the more unknown people in this the story that I've been collecting since 2010. Probably have about 70 African-American people. Roy DeCoverley, he is kind of, I focus on him because the jazz musicians and the painters, they've gotten a lot of love, but I want to focus on people who are not really famous. He's an unknown member of the Harlem Renaissance. He's been lost to history, but a lot of his story is representative of stories of other Black Americans who went to Denmark, and the exhibit actually expands beyond Denmark to all of the Nordic countries, but Denmark is my country of choice. And even though I say he's very common, there's one unusual thing about him. He's an outlier in that he's Jamaican. All the other people are African American, except for one other woman who's also Jamaican, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, representing the Black Panther Party in Scandinavia. And Roy DeCoverley was a member of the Harlem Renaissance. So I'm like, you can't get more Black American than Harlem Renaissance and Black Panther Party. And so Roy DeCoverley, let me go forward. To give you a little bit of a background, we'll actually talk about the painting in a minute. He was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and he actually came to the Harlem in when he was 17 in 1922. He seemed to come alone. He stayed there for 10 years. And while he was here, he was a very active member of the Harlem Renaissance. He was a poet, a dancer, short story writer. He published in major publications. But he was restless, like a lot of the people who ended up in Scandinavia. And a white American friend of his, Robert Schlick, said, you should probably go to Copenhagen, and you would enjoy it. Robert Schlick had done that, and so he went, and I'll talk a little bit more about his time there. You see where he lived there as long as possible, left because of the war, went to England, Jamaica, tried to return, as did William Henry Johnson. After the war, and I always thought it was sad that he died in Jamaica because he seemed to be a wanderer and wanted to live in so many spaces and places, and ended up right where he started. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. So what happened? In 1932, he went like I did on a whim for 2 months, like I did too. I was working on a biography. He said he was working on a novel. He said that a lot, and don't know much about any novel that ever came about. But he went on a whim for 2 months, and he stayed for almost 7 years. Not sure how he swung that. There were some issues about his immigration. But he ended up staying there and reinvented himself. Again, in the Harlem Renaissance, he was a poet-dancer. He became a journalist when he was in Denmark, and he started writing for historical black newspapers about what it's like to be black in Denmark. And then he wrote for the Danish newspapers, Politiken and Berlingske Tidende. They call it BT now, thankfully, about what it's like to be black in America for the Danish papers. And in case you can't actually read, this just gives you a sense of how much he loved Copenhagen. For the Race in Europe, he went around interviewing black people that he interacted with or saw in Copenhagen. And he starts with saying, Copenhagen, the Paris of the North. I don't know if anyone ever called it that besides him. He said, it's the city of towers, copper sheath and blue-green and the silver moonlight, the city of old world canals, rippling dark silver under old bridges with colored sails of fishing boats looming fantastically through pearly mist, the city of bicycles, which it still is, pouring in an endless stream through the streets and over quaint drawbridges with little lights at the evening looking like swarms of fireflies moving through the blue shadowed dusk. I only found one letter of his in any archive, and he wrote back to one of his friends from the Harlem Renaissance, the very famous poet Countee Cullen. And he talked about, this is 1934, after 2 years, he said, I wish you could see our golden October sunlight lying level like liquid over the roofs and copper-clad towers. It is warm, the trees have not begun to think of shedding leaves. And he ends it with, oh, how I love Copenhagen. And he also mentions other people that he knew during the Harlem Renaissance, like Bruce Nugent, you might be familiar with, Harold Jackman, the actress Rose McClinton. But he also, let me see, actually, I'll go back. I should have worked on this. Also, one of the reasons that he went and a lot of other people went to the Scandinavian countries was because they kind of stood out. They wanted to be different than other people. There weren't many black people there. They liked that. Robert Schlick said it's probably better off than going to Paris. In the 20th century, Gregory Partlow, a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, he lived there, right? And he wrote a poem called Copenhagen. And in his memoir, Air Traffic, that came out in 2018, he said, Paris is a cliche. They wanted to go to another space and hang out. And he liked it. And in the same letter to Countee Cullen, Roy de Coverley said, which kind of captures a lot of other people, he said that life is so fantastic these days, I stand rather at a crossroads. He says, the great question is whether to return to 7th Avenue here in New York City or to seek new pastures. I miss Harlem horribly, of course, but then not having a name or any special ability yet, what should I do there? It would be ghastly to begin the rounds of elevators and things again after being somebody, you know? He says, in fact, I won't do it. So he liked standing out, and one of the people he interacted with, Thyra J. Edwards, who was a social activist, she said that Roy de Coverley was much petted and adored while he was there. And so I often tried to find photographs of people in Denmark. It's very difficult. But I found out that Roy de Coverley had a file at the Jamaican National Library. At first, they said I had to go to Jamaica to go see the file. I didn't have any research funds, otherwise I would have told my job I have to go to Jamaica to look at this one little file for 15 minutes. But I said, just send me the images. They didn't know where he was or what he was doing, but when he sent the images, I was like, that is Copenhagen. That's a very famous section of town. The statue's very famous. It's the, I wrote it down, it's one of their, it was the Royal Playhouse and the Old Stage, and he's at this very famous cafe. Now it's one of their best cocktail bars where Hans Christian Andersen used to hang out. It's been around since the 1800s. And at first I thought he was there in the 1930s because black people often look younger than they are. The black don't crack. It turned out that this is actually from when he returned 15 years later. There's this organization on Facebook called Old Copenhagen, and I posted the photos, and they said, oh, again, I'm working on it. They said this building did not exist in the 1930s. This is the 1950s when he was walking around. So he returned after the war. He only left because the war was going on. Because he was Jamaican, he was a British national. He went to Britain. He actually was helping them translate the Scandinavian languages. He said he learned the bewildering language. He was able to figure that out. And then he went to Jamaica, and then eventually went back to Copenhagen and tried to recapture a place where he was very happy, just like William Henry Johnson did. And it didn't really work out for either of the men there. Let's see if I got it right. Nope. And here he wrote this article about returning 15 years later. He must have taken these photographs for a publication. They were never published. They just seemed to be sitting in the archive. But here he is just walking around different parts of the city. Actually, this is Christianshavn. The people from the old Copenhagen, they were like, oh yeah, that's the street. I don't know how they could tell, but it was correct. And he said Christianshavn was his favorite section, which it was also of mine. There are other reasons I think that a lot of the African Americans went there, particularly the men. There's hints and suggestions that perhaps he was also queer and was able to find his a space where he could live his authentic self while he was over there. And there's also some suggestions of other people too. And so that's why he wanted to go back to where he was very happy. In 1935, Roy de Coverley actually wrote a travel piece about Denmark, and he published that in Challenge magazine, which belonged to Dorothy West, the Harlem Renaissance writer. And at the very end, he wrote, after gushing about Copenhagen, he says, he encourages people. He said he didn't know why it wasn't more popular. Yeah, one more image. That's the last image. In Newhound, the very famous section. He says, go to Denmark for yourself and see if I have not erred on the side of understatement. It is a wonderful country and a heartwarming one. There you may relax and drink in the joy of human companionship, nourish yourself with the milk of human kindness, refresh your soul with soft and lyric beauty. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Leslie Anderson from the National Nordic Museum and one of the co-curators of this exhibition, Nordic Utopia, which opened in Seattle on March 22nd, 2024, nearly 1 year ago. And now we prepare to say farewell to this exhibition that's made its way from Washington State to Wisconsin to New York. As we've heard, it examines the history of African-American visual and performing artists, writers, activists, and scholars who first sought training and launched careers in American urban centers, but ultimately left the Nordic countries when travel abroad introduced them to new environments that really fostered creative freedom. The show is organized in 3 main sections and arranged according to a chronology. The first covers the 1930s through the 1950s, examines celebrities, specifically musicians who traveled to the Nordics on tour and may have sojourned there, like Juilliard-trained pianist Eugene Haynes, shown at left. He befriended Danish author Karen Blixen, and this particular photo was printed in a Danish magazine. Haynes' suitcase and other personal effects are the first objects that visitors encounter in Nordic Utopia, really important symbols for travel. And they were actually left at the cottage of Blixen's secretary and now belong to the collection of the museum Amager, which, if you are familiar with the geography of Copenhagen, that's the island where the airport is located, but also a very lovely fishing community called Dragør. As Tamara Walker will soon discuss, opera singer Anne Wiggins-Brown found love in Norway with a member of the Olympic ski jumping team, and you see that referenced in the object, the issue of Ebony magazine at right, which the National Nordic Museum acquired for its collection. In the second section, with the normalization of air travel, jazz musicians and other creatives relocated in the 60s and 70s to the Nordic region. Visual artists received grant funding to continue their training abroad, particularly the John Hay Whitney Fellowship really opened doors to experience the Nordic countries and continue creative work there. Visual and performing artists convened in the Nordics. They exchanged ideas as they had in New York before their arrival abroad, and they supported each other. At left is a work by Herbert Gentry titled Copenhagen, and it references music making around 1961. And at right are vinyl records. The upper right image is Dexter Gordon's A Day in Copenhagen, and you can hear that in the gallery, and underneath Duke Jordan's Flight to Denmark, which was released on the Danish jazz label Steeplechase as one of the first albums. The last section explores rootedness. Visual artists married and started families. They found opportunities to exhibit their work and collaborated with design firms. Creative freedom was a shared sentiment expressed by many of the protagonists in this story. And here we're looking at a photograph of Howard Smith at left and calligraphy plate, which was created for the Finnish ceramics company Arabia in 1986. Both the image and the object were provided by the late artist's family, Erna Aaltonen and Joseph Smith. So my short presentation is really on the location and selections of objects that help tell this story. I was inspired by the press material for the Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism exhibition, which highlighted that, quote, a significant percentage of the painting, sculpture, and works on paper on view in the exhibition come from the extensive collections of historically Black colleges and universities. It also told the story of the Met as collector of relevant material for over 50 years. So in telling the story of assembling loans and making acquisitions in preparation for Nordic Utopia, perhaps we can consider the history of collecting this important work, and in the case of Nordic Utopia, the instrumental role that friends and families play in preserving the artist's stories. Ethelene and I began our exhibition work in 2021. We started a conversation in 2019 about William Henry Johnson when she was visiting the museum. A preliminary checklist formed from works that she had become acquainted with during her research, and that included the painting that I mentioned previously at left, the work at center, which is a mixed media masterpiece by Clifford Jackson, and it shows a jazz quartet. And then the work at right, which is a scene of children amid flowers and butterflies in this halcyon landscape by Walter Williams. The paintings Copenhagen and Quartet, which is the work at center, are in private collections in the US and in Denmark, respectively, and the work at right is held by the David C. Driscoll Center at the University of Maryland College Park, and it was a gift in 2012. Through her biographical research in Denmark, Ethelene had met individuals that would participate in the project, Ronald and Edith Burns, and the photographer Kirsten Malone. 3 of her works are shown on the screen. She was the wife of journalist and co-representative of the Black Panthers in Scandinavia, Leonard Skip Malone, who's shown at right. And she generously shared these photographs of her spouse as well as their friends. Jazz tenor saxophonist Dexter Gordon at left, and bebop jazz singer Babs Gonzalez standing in one of the most photographed spots in all of Denmark. In fact, you've already seen it. That's Nyhavn. But it might be one of my favorite images of Nyhavn because it doesn't appear to be the hot spot for tourists that it is, but really a more familiar space to a resident in this particular image. We also included documentary films, Tem I Mål and Enen Mensland, which were produced and aired by the Danish Broadcasting Corporation, and that provided some context for the creative work in the exhibition. We worked with DR to locate and screen these films in the gallery, which involved deep searches in their archival holdings. I began looking at Nordic and American public and private collections for works of art that could tell the story in the gallery and expand the checklist. So the Johnson Collection in South Carolina was an early supporter of this project. It's a private collection that focuses on the work of Carolina artists and artists of the American South. They lent this beautiful mixed media image of sunflowers by Williams at right, as well as an oil painting by William H. Johnson of Kerteminde Harbor in Denmark at upper left. And the same motif is depicted in a watercolor by Johnson that was recently acquired by the National Gallery of Art in DC. We're very grateful that they participated in this exhibition through this loan of a very light-sensitive work, and it was shown at one venue. While in Sweden, While in Sweden to conduct some research on a grant in 2022, I met with the Moderna Museet to discuss the project. And they lent paintings by Johnson and Burns, as well as photographs of Gordon at a popular jazz club in Stockholm. It no longer exists. Importantly, the photographs were taken by Leif Vai in 1964, and he would actually join the Moderna Museet staff as curator of that medium, and then he donated them to the collection in 1989. And I think the one at right really captures the dynamism of Gordon's performance. But the work by Ronald Burns was purchased by Moderna Museet when it was new, just a year after its execution. Burns, who was born in New York, relocated to Copenhagen in 1965 and was exhibiting in galleries and would become a key member of an artist collective in Copenhagen. William H. Johnson, which you'll soon hear more about, is represented by loans. I mentioned the Johnson Collection, the National Gallery of Art, but also Moderna Museet and SAM. The work on the left was a donation from the artist in 1938, and it had been in storage, so both parties were really thrilled to get it on view and in conversation with other works by Johnson, particularly those from SAM, which is the primary repository of Johnson's work. In fact, the work at right is from that collection, and it was part of the Harman Foundation gift of over 1,000 works by Johnson to SAM in 1967. Galleries played an important role in connecting us to works not publicly held. So we presented works by Herbert Gentry from 1959 to 1964 to illustrate the second section of the exhibition. The work at left, which is untitled, appeared in the first two venues before finding its new home at the Pompidou in Paris. To complement these earlier works with one from his later career, when Gentry had divided his time between New York and Malmö, we borrowed Illumination from the Studio Museum in Harlem. Similarly, we included a collage titled Symbols by Sam Middleton, who spent a brief but formative period in Sweden when he wrote a treatise on collage and really kind of fleshed out this section that explored cross-pollination between visual and performing artists. In the process of organizing the exhibition, the National Nordic Museum acquired objects to represent the story in our collection in perpetuity. So I mentioned some jazz records previously, released by Gordon and Duke Jordan, a symbolic self-portrait by Clifford Jackson at left, as well as issues of Ebony magazine that focused on Anne Wiggins Brown, on the dancer Doug Crutchfield in Denmark and Sweden, and U.S. Ambassador to Denmark, Terence Todman. When an iconic stretch textile by Howard Smith was unavailable for display in another collection, a very helpful fellow curator gave me a tip to send alert for eBay. And voila, Blue Irises entered the collection, and we were able to represent it in the show. It really demonstrates Smith's connection with the Finnish textile firm Valila, and his influence on the domestic interior through such works. After the exhibition opened, Ronald and Edith Burns donated a surrealist-inspired work called Paper Doll Costumes to the museum. So in total, the museum accessioned 8 objects and 1 oral history. And I'll leave with the most exciting moment, I think, in the exhibition's development, which was the discovery that the artist and designer Howard Smith's son, Joseph, lived in the neighborhood of our museum. It was really serendipitous. A teacher in a Seattle school, he was participating in an outreach program that our team runs, and he introduced himself and said his father was an artist. At the same time, we were working on the exhibition, and so this person approached me with this news, not knowing that I had been looking for works by Howard Smith. It was a fabulous thing. We were able to interview him. Our archivist and oral history specialist, Allison Dreamer, was able to capture his story for our oral history collection, which is quite significant, nearly 1,000 interviews. and then to establish a connection to the artist's studio collection. So we borrowed several works from Joseph and from Erna Aaltonen, and some of them will soon appear in a major survey of the artist's career organized by the Palm Springs Art Museum and a museum in Espoo. So I look forward to talking about the creative work and documentary evidence that we show in the exhibition, the history of collecting on the subject, and the repositories of material related to the subject. But first, you're going to hear more about William Henry Johnson from Denise Murrell.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Denise Murrell, and I'm really happy to be here this afternoon to speak with you about William H. Johnson. As noted earlier, I curated an exhibition, The Harlem Renaissance and Transatlantic Modernism, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that opened just about a year ago today, last February. And I wanted to start with a view of this 20-foot tall banner on the facade, which depicts a William H. Johnson painting, to stress the fact that in this exhibition, and really almost any exhibition done about the Harlem Renaissance, William H. Johnson is one of the two or three, if not the single, most iconic artist. So this is a work from the 1940s after his period in Scandinavia. But the way that the particular aesthetic of this work, I think, is something that very much emanated from his 20 years prior to the 1940s, living and working first in France and then in Scandinavia. And just to provide a quick context, the Harlem Renaissance, this is the 1920s, 1930s period, often described as the first Black-led movement of international modern art, a flowering of creativity in art. Archibald Motley, writers, Alain Locke, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, musicians from the big band sounds of the jazz, which defined the Jazz Age, this was the period of the Jazz Age, to renowned stage concert performers like Marian Anderson here. And these artists and writers were depicting in their work every aspect of life in the new Black cities that took place during the Harlem Renaissance. As a result of the Great Migration, this was the movement, mass migration, ultimately millions of African Americans, beginning in the 1910s or so, leaving the segregation and racial terrorism of the rural South, moving to Harlem, which was the single biggest community, but by no means the only new Black city, Chicago, Philadelphia, Oakland, the West Coast, and smaller, mid-sized cities in between. So depicting this expansion of the Black middle class, the sort of freedom of public gatherings, spaces of leisure, both for the middle class and for what the scholar Rick Powell calls the boys in the back room, being true to both Langston Hughes, who very much advocated representing the jazz aesthetic, this urbane, cultivated, cosmopolitan city life. Zora Neale Hurston said we have to keep the everyday person, the narratives of people who migrated from the rural South to the North. So you see all of that reflected here. Johnson was part of the Great Migration. He was born in 1901 in Florence, South Carolina, a small town, moved to New York when he was 18, did a lot of small jobs. He was living with family, but got admitted to the National Academy of Design, where he studied for several years. And we see him here, this is 23, early 20s, the type of self-portrait that he might have made, he would have made, these are during his student years, as part of the process of learning to paint and thinking about the various influences and styles that would ultimately shape his own unique visual language. And that journey began in 1928 when he won a number of awards at the National Academy, and that ultimately enabled him to move to Europe. And like many other, not just African American artists, period, the first stop, extended stop, was in Paris, and then ultimately the south of France. So here we see him working, still life that evokes sort of Cézannean aesthetics. Then moving to the south of France, he settled in Cagnes-sur-Mer, where he worked alongside post-impressionist like James Soutine, in a style, kind of this impressionistic style that by then, this is like 50 years after Impressionism, would have been considered the type of academic training that an artist would go through. But one thing that happened in Cagnes is that he met Hocha Craik, a Danish artist and weaver who was living there at the time. They became close very quickly. He did, however, in 1930 come back to the US, and that was when he really began to be integrated into what was happening in Harlem. He started showing at the Harman Foundation exhibitions, won the Gold Prize in 1930. He also made his first trip in 12 years back to Florence, South Carolina, and I'm showing here how his style is beginning to evolve. He's finding his own mode of articulating his artistic vision with something that is much more arguably like the sort of strong gestural stroke, the impastoed surfaces of the canvas, the distortion of observed reality that you would see in some of the northern avant-garde styles, including German Expressionism, which he was exposed to through his contacts with this international group of artists, first in the south of France and then later also in New York. He was going to major museum shows, gallery shows, et cetera. So by, I think it's 1930, he moves back to Europe. He marries Hocha Craik, and they move to Denmark. Her family is in Copenhagen, I think, primarily, and they spend time there, where they ultimately settle in Kerteminde, the lovely seaside fishing village to the north of Denmark. And I'm showing you this juxtaposition because we see on the one hand the type of work that he was making during that brief period when he went back to Florence. Florence is a small rural town in South Carolina, so he's beginning to moderate the academic styles of his earlier years and using this, very expressive treatment of the streetscape that he is seeing there, and he applies a similar style to his early paintings of Kerteminde. And we see portraits that also reflect this very firmly shaped, it's kind of the opposite of Impressionism, firmly drawn, and strong gestural strokes paint on the canvas, often very heavily layered. He's experimenting with medium. He is usually painting, but it could be on board, on canvas, on burlap, really just pulling in a lot of experimental approaches. And again, while he had been in South Carolina, he had made some portraits of his family and other locals, and we see, this is 1930, some of his early portraits of Danish subjects, and I think an affinity, a similarity of style there. While during this time, the 1930s, I think they're there from until at least 1935, 36. And they are living in Kurtaminde, where he's having gallery exhibitions. He's also showing in Copenhagen, but also traveling around Scandinavia. They go to Norway and spend several years there. And so here I'm just kind of showing a throwback to a painting of the south of France, and this is a streetscape, a view towards Akersgata in Oslo, to just show this kind of evolution of his painterly style. But still sticking to the subject matter that had inspired him from the very beginning of his career, landscapes. There's a whole body of still life, as well as coming back to portraits. And some of it is deliberately, gives the effect of being rough-hewn, untaught, the distortion of proportions and so forth. He's looking at folk art, especially in the seafaring communities around Kurtaminde. He becomes aware of woodblock prints. He didn't make that many images of himself and Hoxha, but this is one of them. This is 1935 or so. And so he's just experimenting in a very free-form way with stylistic aesthetics. But things are changing. I think the young woman in the red dress is just one of his finest portraits, and he makes that. She is a young resident of Volga, in Norway. So during his travels, while he was in Norway, he had gallery exhibitions, very high-profile gallery exhibitions. He was represented by the same gallery as the Norwegian expressionist Edvard Munch, and they had alternating shows there. They met, did not have a real collaboration, but they knew each other. So this particular type of approach to portraiture, I think, is just presenting itself in a very self-assured manner by 1935, toward the end of this 1930s period in Scandinavia. And that period ends because of World War II. So by 1938, he leaves Scandinavia together with Hoxha this time. They move to New York City. They live in Harlem, a few other places around the city. And he becomes just an incredibly prolific maker of portraiture, of street scenes, etc., depicting this urbane city life. Individual subjects like we see here, and I'm just showing again the type of the seated figure posed on this chair that some observers think evokes Van Gogh. We saw his impressionist influences earlier in his career, monumentalize these broad expanses of bold color, and the way that he plays with proportions, uses the influence of just kind of European modernist figural treatment, but also mask-like visages that emanate from African sculpture. And these are all the types of pictorial elements that were advocated by Alain Locke, by Langston Hughes, and by other thinkers of the Harlem Renaissance. So street life Harlem, just more of this, the iconic portrait, and this painting, the portrait, Girl in Blue, I hope it's iconic now, but it was pretty much unknown at the time that we did this show. As Leslie mentioned, we were visiting, about 40% of our show, the loans for our show came from historically black colleges and universities, and for the most part, those collections are not digitized, so I spent a great deal of time visiting and revisiting, going through storerooms and so forth, and I came across this as a very accomplished painting that had been better known by a small kind of, watercolor and a study for this composition that had been published widely because it was owned by Smithsonian, by SAM, and they had the ability to publish and distribute this image. So to bring this forward, it had major conservation needs. Our conservators worked with a local Atlanta studio to just stabilize it enough so they could move to New York and then finalize work so that we could show it in the galleries. So this was a period he's representing, again, every aspect of, life in this new Black city, the epicenter of Harlem, where he and his wife lived. Nightlife. He became involved with the early years of the civil rights movement, which emanated in part from New York City. The NAACP was founded, had its first offices in New York in the late teens, early 20s, had mass marches down Fifth Avenue. But on the other hand, racial oppression was not absent in cities like New York. There were race riots where people were murdered, and he depicted that as well. And you're seeing something of a stylistic evolution again here, the elongated figure. He's looking not just at folk art, but at comic books, and but also just his imagination, trying to capture a scene that had been widely depicted in news reports and so forth in unique visual language. And just to show the trajectory here, and by the way, I'm showing this as I show my left, all of the yellow, the ones that are highlighted in yellow, are works that are in the exhibition downstairs. So I wanted to pull in these other images just to show the affinities and subject matter and stylistic treatment and so forth. He goes back briefly to South Carolina in 1940 or so, and this is a portrait of his mother and his deceased father, depicted as a portrait on the wall. So he remained interested, even though he's in the middle of this urbane, new Negro lifestyle of the Harlem Renaissance. He always was engaged with and treated with great respect and affinity rural subjects, both in Scandinavia and in New York. So this final slide captures that trajectory again. We see him in 1935, just before he leaves Europe, at the peak of life and career. During his time in Europe, he was not only exhibiting in Europe, he was shipping work back to the States to be shown there. I think it was winning awards in numerous exhibitions and so forth. But again, life changed. They had almost 7 years in New York together, he and Hoja. By 1943, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, moved into a hospice where she died in New York City in 1944, January 1944. So this triple self-portrait, which is one of the very last paintings that we know of by William H. Johnson, was made a few months after his wife's death. And another painting, very rarely published, from an HBCU collection. This is Hampton Institute in Virginia. And the curators there read this as a portrayal of mourning, depicting himself in the center with his white, just kind of the early first stage of grief and searching for a spiritual rationale for the way his life has been totally upended by his beloved wife's death, and then the various stages of soothing and self-soothing that one goes through. So even though a Danish subject is not explicitly represented here, his Danish wife Hoja is very much a part of the meaning, as we understand it, for this one of these final paintings by Johnson. He clearly regarded that period as a golden period in his personal life, and part of his grieving was to go back to Scandinavia in 1946. He was beginning to have mental problems by then, spent time with in-laws in Copenhagen, then went to Norway, where he was picked up by the police as a vagrant, brought back to the US by the State Department, and by 1949-50, he was committed to a mental institution on Long Island, where he spent the next 22 years and died in 1970, making no more work. So that's the life trajectory within which I think we should regard the both the artistic production, but also the profound emotional attachment that William H. Johnson had to his life and years in Scandinavia. Thank you.
I'm Tamara Walker, and I want to start by saying thank you to Ethelene, Eve, and Emily for the invitation to be here today. I got to see the exhibition in Seattle with Leslie in the spring, and here in New York with Ethelene when it opened in November. And each time I was struck by the presence of three themes that I want to spend my time talking about today. And those themes are love, loss, and longing. So let's start with love. So many of the African Americans who arrived in the Nordic countries did so because they'd fallen in love, and we've heard some of that already today. Herbert Gentry met his wife in France and moved with her to her native Sweden. And then there's Anne Brown, who Leslie mentioned in her talk. In the November 1953 Ebony article that's included in the exhibition, we hear about her having fallen in love. She first fell in love with Norway itself after making a stop there during a concert tour. She was a singer. She fell in love with the shade of green on the snow-covered trees, the sense of peaceful isolation she felt in the woods, which was no small thing coming from the United States, and the warmth of the people themselves who showed her nothing but welcome and admiration. And of course, there was one person in particular, Thorleif Schlederup. He sat in the front row of one of her concerts, then found a way to meet her backstage, then began writing a series of letters that culminated in the one that I share a bit of on screen. And I'll just read that bit. He says, "Now, Anne, we have to decide several things. Shall we live in Europe or America? Shall we have 10 children or 20? Shall we have a big house or a small one?" And then there's an ellipsis. It's not mine, it's hers. "On a mountain or deep in the woods?" And I kept wondering, shall we do what on a mountain or deep in the woods? But it's so romantic, right? And how could she not pack her bags and hunker down in Norway? And that sense of romance, I think, pervades throughout the exhibition. I also, when I first saw this article in Seattle, I told Leslie, and I was struck by the fact that it appeared in Ebony because I knew from my work on my book, Beyond the Shores, that Richard Wright had tried and failed to publish a piece in Ebony around the same time about his decision to move to Paris. And he had made this deal with Ebony in 1949 before he went to Argentina, where I write about him, to film Native Son. And he had contracted a couple articles to make a living as a writer and also to draw attention to his film. And only one of those articles appears in Ebony, and it's an article about the making of the film. But what doesn't appear is the essay he wrote, I Choose Exile, which never appeared in Ebony. It's an unpublished piece. And I was really struck by the fact that Richard Wright is telling a similar story, right, about having fallen in love with Paris. But I think the tone was what Ebony bristled at, that what they didn't necessarily want their readers to read about and to feel in the 1950s was a sense that the US was a place to give up on, and that exile was necessary to experience one's full humanity. And so I think what's striking about the I gave up my country for love is that she's not rejecting the US, she's choosing Norway, choosing love. And I think that's why that appeared in Ebony and not Richard Wright's essay. So obviously there's this romance thread that runs throughout the exhibition. But I was also struck by a sense of melancholy running throughout it. I was struck by the fact that for all the things that brought them to the Nordic countries, whether it was love or opportunity or a sense of adventure, that African Americans also had to leave something behind. Whatever they gained would come with the loss of their sense of home, their sense of family, their sense of community. And again, I had this in my head as I was working on Beyond the Shores, because for me, for all the ways that the story of African Americans going abroad is a story of romance, adventure, and opportunity, it's also a tragedy that people had to leave the country of their birth, the country where their families were, the country that they knew best for these other places in order to experience their humanity and to have adventure and to experience romance. So that's on my mind, and maybe that's why I read this image in that way, and maybe I'm reading too much into it. But when I look at it, I see a man apart. I see him standing apart. I see him on a singular journey that required shedding something and losing a bit of himself. And maybe I think that because of his name, which he changed from Lee Brown. He was born in Newark, New Jersey, Lee Brown. And that's because he, like so many African Americans at the time, knew that changing one's name and choosing a Spanish or Portuguese sounding name was a key to getting opportunities. And I think that makes for an interesting connection to the exhibition around the corner at the Pierpont Morgan Library, where we learn about Belle da Costa Green, who was born Belle Greener, but chose this Portuguese sounding name to sound less black, and it worked. And I think that's an interesting story about the early 20th century, that African Americans of all stripes, whether they were athletes or entertainers or ordinary professionals, chose these names to seem, despite all appearances, right, less black. And I think that was the key for Babs to make it to this part of the world. He talks about having chosen this name to avoid harsh treatment at a hospital, but he kept it. And in keeping it, he had to leave something of himself behind and to have a certain new identity forged in the loss of another. Then there's Walter Williams, someone we've heard about today already. And as you've probably seen, if you've seen the exhibition and seen the other piece that Leslie shared, a recurring motif in his work is childhood. And a lot of the images of these sunflower fields feature children in them. His own mother died when he was 5 years old, and he was raised by a strict father in his mother's absence. And so I read some of this work as an attempt to recover or to revisit a lost childhood. But in addition to loss, I see some longing. He painted these works far from the place of his birth, but they seem to reflect a longing to return over and over again. And elsewhere he says that he's always painting the same picture over and over in his career. So that's where I started to think about longing. And that sense of longing also came through for me when I came across Howard Smith's work in the exhibition. And it's not really because of the work itself, which, as we've seen, and as you see here, is really vibrant and it's energetic, and it really emblematizes one thing that I think powerfully comes through in this exhibition, which is that in being in these places and escaping the weight and the trauma of US racism, African American artists were able to uncover parts of themselves and their talents that might otherwise have stayed buried. At the same time, I keep thinking about something he said about his relationship to the United States, and I'll read his words again. He said, "I got lonesome there in Finland. I need the spiritual input, I guess, of being around Black people. This life that we all need is the fire that comes most abundantly from Blacks to me than from other people." I think it's a really powerful set of words, and I think they're a powerful reminder that this country is not just the hardships and the traumas and the ongoing assaults on who we are and what we represent and what we value, which continue to torment us even now, even this month, even today. I think his words remind us that while all of that may be true, it's also true that we're here. We're the fire. Thank you.
So before we open it up to your questions, I thought we might just touch on a few kind of recurring themes or subjects. First is journalistic writing. How has it figured in your research? We talked about Right to Coverly, Anne Riggins Brown, and certainly the importance of magazines like Ebony in telling these stories. So I'll leave it pretty open.
The black press was very interested in what was going on abroad, and a lot of people had columns, like there was a professor, Giles Hubert, who was there in the 1930s for a year doing research, and he had a column for the Atlanta Daily World. I remember one was about policemen and how nice they were in comparison to, and how helpful they were to them. There was also, I forgot to mention, Roy de Coverley, as I mentioned, he wrote for the black newspapers and also for the Danish papers in the 30s. 30 years later, Leonard Skip Malone, who was mentioned in the exhibit, he also did the same thing, published for black magazines and newspapers. And so they were very fascinated by it, but also the Danish press. So I looked at a lot of Danish publications just by searching names, and thank goodness for Google Translate. And they were very fascinated with what was going on with the civil rights movement. On the cover of one newspaper, they talked about Ethelene Lucy, which she's kind of been forgotten, but she tried to desegregate University of Alabama. And a lot of the black celebrities who were there, they would ask them questions about what's going on with the civil rights movement. And if you know the history, sometimes they take away the passports of people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. So a lot of them said, I'm not talking about America. Like Eugene Haynes, they asked him about what was going on. He was there in the 50s and 60s. And he says, I'm not going to talk about my country and get into trouble. Or sometimes people walk things back, or they had very cheerful expressions about what was going on in the United States. So I would translate, I would be like, what? And the reporter would be like, what? They're like, are these your experiences, or is this what you're thinking? They were very, very cautious when talking to the Danish publications, but a lot of them wrote to black publications about what was going on.
When I think about journalistic writing in the Harlem Renaissance period, I think first of the two journals, Crisis Magazine, published by the NAACP, and Opportunity, which was published by the National Urban League. And those were often the first steps for artists, including William H. Johnson, but also Aaron Douglas, Laura Wheeler Waring, Augusta Savage, many others, to just come to public visibility. They weren't getting the mainstream New York City or U.S. museum exhibitions and so forth. So writing about their exhibitions as well as essays by some of the artists themselves is an important part of the Harlem Renaissance literature. And I want to, as far as the Scandinavian press, I really want to give a shout out to my colleague, Rick Powell, who in his 1990 publication, Homecoming, about William H. Johnson, put together, he spent months, possibly maybe longer, in Copenhagen, in Oslo. He excavated the critical reviews that were published of Johnson's work, got some help, did some translation of that material, and published all of this in this volume, Homecoming. So scrutinizing that, you can really get a sense of the critical response to Johnson's stylistic evolution and embrace of more northern avant-garde traditions, including woodblock, using woodblock, making woodblock prints, engagement with expressive as opposed to impressionistic aspects of pictorial style, and affinity for landscape and still life, and rural scenes as well as urban cityscapes. So a lot of this is discussed and debated in the Scandinavian press of the time and captured, I think, in a way that's a real service to the field by Rick Powell in his book.
So I think maybe my next question kind of brings together something that you mentioned in your presentation, Ethelene, in crowdsourcing information on location of a photograph. I could tell you a bit more, and connects with a conversation that I had earlier with Denise on the kind of community of scholars really working to expand understanding of this subject matter. So could you talk a little bit about the community of researchers that have come together around this topic generally.
Are you talking about something specific? I feel like you're hinting, but you have to remind me. That's some conversation we had before.
We talked a little bit about posting an image and getting feedback on the location. Have you engaged in similar work and kind of reaching out to scholars? And I know that there are other major grant-funded projects right now that bring together scholars from the Nordic countries and North America on the subject matter.
I guess I've just been open and been doing this for several years. The actual portrait of Roy de Coverley we found by a Danish artist that I knew. She invited me to lunch with a Danish art historian who was looking for different information, and then she came up with this portrait. She knew Roy de Coverley had been painted by this woman, but the information had been lost, and she wasn't sure if that was Roy de Coverley, and we did some research. So I guess just word of mouth, just serendipity. We keep finding all these different resources by reaching out and knowing different people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, during the development of the Harlem Renaissance exhibition, I definitely met extensively with scholars who have covered the Harlem Renaissance for the last decades. They were primarily in academia. The major museums or the large museums like the Met and our peers just did not collect the Harlem Renaissance, certainly not during the period, and only in more recent years beginning to make some acquisitions. But going to academia was really helpful. And then the archival research, when visiting Fisk University, Howard, Clark Atlanta, Spelman, Hampton, the HBCUs, I'm not only going into the archives, which are often offsite, they're so extensive. I mean, there are entire museums in storerooms in these university collections, but also the Alain Locke archives at Howard's Library and other, the archives of publications like The Crisis and so forth. We had a couple of research associates helping me with this, and then I edited a catalog of 9 different guest essayists for the exhibition, and all of them were doing this archival work as well. And as far as Scandinavia is concerned, I checked with the National Gallery in Denmark, Dorthe Aagason. I think a number of you probably have met her. She's the chief curator there, and she okayed my mentioning at this convening that they have assembled a working group, a research group, to do an in-depth look into William H. Johnson's 15 years or so in Scandinavia, in Denmark, but also Norway, exhibitions in Sweden, and so forth. And I've joined this on behalf of the Met. A couple of curators from the Smithsonian American Art Museum are participating. We're thinking about bringing in another European venue, and we are just pooling our resources, developing checklists, developing lists of scholars who have written about this in one way or another, looking to have a convening sometime in the fall where we'll pull in our academic peers to see just what kinds of exhibitions and publication projects could take place around this very rich period of creativity of Johnson in Scandinavia. So stay tuned. Hopefully a few years down the road, we'll start seeing some of the fruits of that.
I'll just share something briefly about the kind of sharing that has emerged since the exhibition has been out in the world. I had written a piece about the exhibition when I saw it in Seattle in Smithsonian Magazine, and it featured a picture, that same picture of Babs Gonzalez, and I got an email from someone who knew him when he was alive, a Danish friend of his, and it's, I think, an interesting example of the power of the internet and the power of this kind of project, because then it brings people out who wouldn't otherwise have known about it, and brings their stories into the record, right, and brings about new ways of seeing and remembering these figures, and I think the stories that he was telling, one about Babs being turned away from a nightclub in Copenhagen around the Vietnam War era, and another about seeing him shortly before he was diagnosed with cancer and seeing that he had lost the sparkle in his eyes, I think obviously are on my mind and add to my sense of the melancholy of the image. But I think, I'm sure you both have stories about that as well, just hearing from people, hearing from family members, all of that has come about as a result of the exhibition happening and getting the publicity it's gotten.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say too, we had a program with Dr. Davia Crutchfield and Amir George that looked at the life of dancer and choreographer Doug Crutchfield, and it felt like a very generative gathering because there was conversation about the archival holdings, which are currently with the family, and the future of that.
Yeah, and I remember you said someone from Seattle actually was so inspired they went to his grave to lay flowers when they were visiting in Indiana, which is not near Cincinnati, Ohio, but close. And so, I think the best part of just reaching out to the family members, a lot of them came over for the opening of this reception in November. They came, the widow of Howard Smith came from Finland, and he's, again, from New Jersey, so a lot of his family members came over, found out one of his a son-in-law was actually from my hometown. We went to the same high school, so we had that connection. But also Ronald Burns, his widow, came, and also his son-in-law, his daughter, his grandchildren. One of them was actually in South America. They came over just for the opening. So I think that's been the best part, and they've just been so grateful. And well, actually, Herb Gentry's wife is here too, Mary Ann. And I don't know if often Dexter Gordon's wife, I don't know. Oh, there she is, Maxine. So they're often very engaged, and it's great to see them out here. Do you want to open it up for? I want to hear what people want to.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience?
Okay. Lori. Hi.
I'm very excited to, Ethelene and I have the same publisher.
Oh, there's a mic.
Oh, you're the same publisher, and I'm looking forward to your book.
Thank you.
I'm very excited for that. My question is, I'm a research nut, as you are, and all of you are, and my area of specialty is the 20s and the 30s with Amelia Earhart, and I found the black press to have a very different story than the white press. And there was an extensive black press network, and I'm wondering if you found coverage of these artists that differed very differently in these two. I mean, it's very easily available to any researcher, particularly if you're in New York, through the New York Public Library. You can just get it from your home. But I was wondering if there was a disconnect between the coverage of what you were seeing.
I hardly saw anyone covered by the white press, to be honest. Or Booker T. Washington, who I start my project with when he went to Denmark in 1910. That was covered because he was invited to meet the king and queen of Denmark. He was the first black person to have an audience. And so the New York Times wrote a very, neutral saying he meant the king and queen. But the black press was like, the Danish royalty bowed down to the wizard, those kinds of things. They're very enthusiastic in the headlines. So they covered a lot of the black people going over there, but when I looked in the New York Times or other major newspapers, there was hardly any coverage of their experiences over there. The Danish press did, but I didn't see that much at all.
Yeah, just an expanded note to that. We didn't show any of these images, but they are in the gallery upstairs. There are amazing holdings from the Museum of Copenhagen that have photojournalistic images of Josephine Baker and Coleman Hawkins and so many others. Fats Waller, who went to Denmark and kind of accompanied these stories that Ethelene mentions were published in Politiken and Berlinska, for example.
Well, actually, since you bring up this broader category of artists, it reminds me of how often it was the case that when the white press did talk about some of these artists going to Europe, they didn't want to hear comparisons to the US. They wanted to hear impressions of Europe, but they were really disinterested in hearing any sort of critique of the US and what was not possible in the US and what kinds of freedoms awaited them in Europe. And so I was always struck by that kind of refusal on part of the mainstream white press to actually listen to what many of these people had to say.
I will admit I'm just beginning, as part of the project I just described, to look at the Black press in terms of coverage of Scandinavia. But I can say that looking at a number of African American artists during this Harlem Renaissance period who were in France, first of all, the leading thinkers, W.E.B. Du Bois was, and Alain Locke, both spent extended periods traveling across Europe, as well as elsewhere in the world, and they published articles in The Crisis, in Opportunity, in the Black newspapers, the Baltimore Sun, et cetera, profiling their own observations as well as the artists and writers, especially the Black artists and writers that they encountered across Europe. And W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, was one of the co-founders of these Pan-African alliances that met regularly in the early 1920s. So that is definitely an area of research, I think, that needs more excavation.
I saw a hand in the 6th row from earlier. Yes, you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the great presentation. My first question is, in this time period covered by the exhibition, were there any artists, active in the art scene from the Black community who were born in Scandinavia that you came across? And also, my second question is, I was kind of just thinking in comparison to Paris, for example, William Gardner Smith's book, The Stone Face, where he kind of alludes to, as tensions were rising with the Algerian War, it changed the experience a little bit of the Black community in Paris. Some more racism, and that combined with sort of the growing momentum of the civil rights movement in the US drew some people actually away from Paris back to the US. And I was curious if that also triggered a migration to other parts of Europe, such as Scandinavia, or what, kind of the experience, I guess, of race was at different periods there.
Well, I focus on African Americans, and nothing comes to mind. I'm sure there were Black artists. There are now definitely a lot of Black artists who were born and raised in Scandinavia doing stuff in the 21st century. And Marianne, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that why Herb left Paris, because of that Algerian war?
Oh, yeah, because he was getting stopped on the streets of Paris.
Yeah.
And his Danish friends insisted he come up to Copenhagen and be safe with them.
Right, so he left
And
because of those
so
reasons.
that was a big deal. And these are all, I used to sometimes take her stories because I didn't figure out, he's 30 years older than me and stuff. But, these were the stories he told me. And seemed significant. It's hopping around, and all this discussion where people, the influences over generations of migrations is really important to think about, because Herb's mom was a dancer, but she was born in Jamaica, so she was an immigrant, right? So she left his dad, so who was he raised by? Jamaican immigrants, right, in Harlem. And so it becomes more complicated. And then there was the issue of why did the artists go there, and a number of them, the ones in this show had, they were drafted for different wars. And it wasn't just, Herb was World War II. And of course, who did he meet during the war in a transitional place in the south of France? Josephine Baker, who danced with his mom and inspires him further, but it's a back and forth and back and forth. And that is important too. And I was thinking also about people, the first people when I moved with her to Malmö, Sweden, one of the first people I met with her was a fellow, he was born 1940, still alive, named Matabuko Diakite. And then his son became a superstar kind of dance what was it, rap, kind
It
of.
was in the exhibition, right?
Yes, in the companion publication to Nordic Utopia, there is a really lovely essay by Ryan Thomas Skinner on Jason. Mhm.
Right, so, it continued, so yeah, he was born in Sweden.
I think it's important to recognize that even as the Black artists, writers, musicians found greater personal freedom during their periods of expatriation for various reasons, I think the loneliness factor that you spoke about was a real thing. And I think about Ethelene's, that fabulous article, Travel Story, that she wrote for the New York Times, which made me want to just head to JFK right on the spot. But she talks about Nella Larson, the writer, passing, who was biracial, Danish, African American, and she had real difficulty. She talked about, being treated, singled out as an exotic person because of her darker skin tone and so forth. So I think these were definitely issues that were present. But they were, to varying degrees, they were mitigated by personal relationships, family, friends, and so forth, and had different outcomes for different people. Larson definitely came back to the US, did not have exactly a happy life back here either, but she cited that as a reason, this sense of wanting to be around Black people. And part of what she writes about in novels like Passing and so forth is the impossible dilemma of wanting to escape Blackness, but also needing to be part of specifically the African American community. So there are nuances here. There are complexities. There are very few panaceas.
I like someone mentioned William Gardner Smith, my colleague at Wisconsin, Leila Amin, is a French-Moroccan woman in the English department. She's actually writing a book about people who return, the African Americans who return. So many people focus on those that went abroad, but why did people come back to the United States? And I think that'll be interesting too. And she mentions William Gardner Smith as one of them.
I think we've reached the end of our time, but the conversation need not end. Please, the panelists are available to talk after this, and the galleries are open. I want to thank Scandinavia House not only for organizing today's panel, but also for hosting this exhibition. I'll turn it over to Ed.
Yes. Thank you to all of our speakers. It's been a great afternoon, really illuminating, and there's a lot more to talk about and a lot more that can happen in the future, so we're looking forward to all of that. So thank you very much. Leslie, it's a terrific show. It's great to collaborate with you. Ethelene, you've been a wonderful curator and partner, and I hope we can work together. We're so proud that both of you are fellows of the ASF, and it's a great relationship which we take great pride in, so thank you so much. Again, thank you all for being here. I thank you also for all the organizations and individuals which helped made this possible. Too many to mention, but we appreciate the support that we've received from our donors and from those who made it possible at the National Nordic Museum. And again, Ethelene, Leslie Ann, and Denise, and thank you very much. Tamara, thank you so much. Thank you.